The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to STEM Central. Today we are very proud to host the third of a series of STEM Central University short courses, which we hope will be of significant value to you. These short courses have been designed to offer our STEM Central audience valuable tools, insights, and information that's relevant to their perspective of STEM higher education reform. As you know, more and more our funders are now requiring us to find better ways of documenting the effectiveness of our projects and programs. More than that, though, the work of reforming undergraduate STEM education itself now calls upon us to find meaningful ways of capturing the nuances that we as expert practitioners inherently understand to not be easily captured within the scope of quantitative metrics. Therefore, our understanding of, our respect for, and our expertise in evaluation is now more critical than ever, especially if we are indeed to reform undergraduate STEM education and remain competitive in national funding competition. For that reason, we're joined here today by our dynamic webinar speakers, Dr. Melvin Hall, who is Professor of Education Psychology at Northern Arizona University, and our resident STEM Central Distinguished Professor for the 2016 STEM Central Short Course Series. Melvin is joined today by Dr. Richard Kopek, who is the Associate Dean and Professor of Computer Science at St. Edward's University. Melvin and Richard, welcome to STEM Central, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Before we get started, though, our STEM Central Community Manager, Tanya Siemens, will go over several housekeeping matters that we need to be made aware of. Enjoy the webinar. Tanya?
Thank you, Kelly. And yes, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Tanya Siemens, the STEM Central Manager, and I would just like to share with you some quick information about how we can make this webinar as engaging as possible today. We do have a lot of people out there in the audience today, so we are very excited to have a lively conversation and hear all of your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, we encourage you to do so by typing it into the question answer box in your control panel. I will be managing the questions from the background during the webinar and will be reading your questions out loud at appropriate times. If it's a clarifying question for a slide, I'll go ahead and try to get it addressed right away. Otherwise, we do have a few pauses during the presentation where we'll be addressing questions. Also, if you'd like to, we have the PowerPoint slides and a PDF form available for you to download and view and print out to have as a resource during the webinar. And if you look in your chat box, there's a link to where you can download those slides, so I encourage you to do that. And also at that very same link, later today, you will be able to actually view the recording of the webinar and access other resources. If we don't get to your questions today, don't worry. We will address them afterwards and post responses from Melvin and Richard on STEM Central at that very same page in the webinars tab. So I hope you enjoy the webinar. I look forward to your questions, and with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Melvin and turn off my webcam until the end of the webinar. So I'll see you all later.
Hello, thank you, Tanya and Kelly. It's a pleasure to visit with some of you again, and for some of you perhaps the first time, to talk about program evaluation, a topic that I've been engaged in now for over 40 years. I primarily teach in program evaluation, research design, and human relations. So you'll hear a little bit of all of those things coming out in my presentation and my responses to your questions. Just a little bit of an overview. This set of webinars is intended to support STEM reform by expanding capacity in terms of what we think evaluation can do to promote our programs and to assist in STEM reform efforts. And what we've attempted to do with this webinar series is blend discussion of evaluation with a specific project case study. So you have the opportunity of anchoring the information about evaluation in the real context of a project similar to yours. So I'll be taking advantage of the case study that Richard will present as I come back a little later and talk more about evaluation and things that you might expect an evaluator to contribute to your project. Just to underscore one important point, through the whole seminar series, what I've tried to emphasize in one way or another is that evaluators are really just as valuable as co-conceptualizers as they are in documenting outcomes of your project. So I'm encouraging you to engage your evaluator in the process of helping to conceptualize your project. So now I'd like to turn the keyboard and mouse over to Richard, who will take you through his case study.
Thank you, Melvin. As Kelly said, my name is Richard Kopek. I am with St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas. And the project I'm going to talk about is a STEP grant that we received in 2010. And the project name is the Community for Achievement in Science, Academics, and Research. And for short, that's the CASAR project. And Melvin, oh, here we go. So just to give you a little context of who we are so you can see the background associated with this project, St. Edward's is a private Catholic affiliated liberal arts Hispanic serving institution. 37% of our students are Hispanic, 49% of them are minorities, 40% of them are Caucasian. We have a total enrollment about 4,600 students, and 4,000 or so of those are undergraduates, and the remainder are graduate students. In master's programs, service level master's programs, none of those programs are STEM programs. And this is our academic year data from 2015-16. The STEP project was motivated by what we unfortunately learned when we studied it was poor STEM retention at the university. We found that in the years preceding the submission of the STEP grant, we were losing 40 to 60% of our first-time freshman STEM majors by the end of the first year. So they didn't come back as STEM majors. They may have come back to the university, but they did not come back in STEM. And it varied. It was between 40 and 60. So we were thinking about what to do, what we could do about that, and the STEP grant program at that time was designed to improve STEM graduation rates. And of course, one way to improve graduation rates is to improve retention rates. So at St. Ed's, we require all of our first-time students to reside on campus. And so the solution that we came up with to sort of address the problems was to create a science living learning community. So we were taking advantage of the fact that all of our students have to live on campus. So we designed the CASAR project, and whoops, a little too fast there. What we were trying to do, since we are a Hispanic serving institution, and many of the students who left STEM were in fact Hispanics, as well as underrepresented students, we decided to set up the project in such a way that we could improve their academic performance and ultimately their academic success to address retention, persistence, and graduation, and also to help them with graduate school. We, at the same time, studies have shown that particularly Hispanic students, but I think all students, do well when they feel supported and when they feel like they're part of a community. And so that was the other thing that drove the formation of the learning community. And this is based on work by Tinto in the past. So we aim to set up a program that would support them all the way through. And so to accomplish those goals, we needed to increase STEM GPAs, we need to improve retention, and therefore we would improve graduation rates. We wanted to increase the number of students who could go on to postgraduate work if they so desired. We wanted to create a comprehensive support network for the students in the community. And most importantly, we wanted to create a sense of community with all of the students in the learning community, as well as with those of us who were supporting the community. And many of our students come in with not a really good understanding of how much time and energy they have to put into their classes, and I think you've probably noticed that as well. And so we also aim to help them to understand that this is serious business here. It's not high school, and they really have to work. And we wanted them to understand all the hoops that they have to jump through to get through college, and for those that were planning to go on for further study, to getting into graduate and professional schools. So those were the things that we were trying to accomplish here. So the strategies that we implemented, many of which are based on the AAC&U high impact practices described by Koo in his 2008 publication, which you can find at the AAC&U website. Of course, we created an interdisciplinary residential learning community. We call it the Living Learning Community. And it is composed of first-year students only, students who are in college for the first time. And the components that make up the whole package include a pre-college bridge program, which we called the Freshman Accelerated Research Methods Workshop, where we would bring students onto campus in the original version of this about 2 weeks before classes begin, and we spent a whole week putting them through workshops in chemistry, biology, mathematics, computer science, and in bioinformatics. That was really the catalyst to the formation of community, because they are the only ones that are on campus at that time. They're living in a residence hall. They're all on the same floor, the same residence hall. There's nobody else around. There's no other programming. And it's kind of like they don't have anything else to do but spend time with each other. And it has been a very good way to start it. Then in the fall, since it's interdisciplinary, we created a first-year seminar course specifically for these students, which we have over time expanded to other students. We created a first-year seminar course that is another best practice, and all of them will take that class, and that is the only class that they will all take together because it's interdisciplinary, and so they're taking their STEM classes are all going to be different. That's followed up in the spring with what I call the Science Seminar course, and that sets them up to do, for those that are interested, research projects in the summer. To make it attractive to students before they ever came here, to get them to apply, because they do have to apply, we also had a textbook stipend of $300, which we have since discontinued, because it turns out that most of them, that wasn't a big deal for them, although they claimed that it was. Most of them, some of them didn't even apply for it. We sent tutors to the residence hall directly, rather than them having to go to the tutors came to them. And in the first semester we did what I call cohort scheduling. So all of those in the community, for example, that were taking the Gateway Biology course or the first semester biology course, they would all be in the same section. And we did that with all of their STEM courses because those are the ones that I have some control over. And then finally, the year completes, the freshman year completes with the optional summer research project. And the summer research project is primed in the Science Seminar course, which I've already mentioned, which we do in the spring, where faculty who are willing to supervise the freshmen come in and talk to the freshmen about what their projects are. And then the students have an idea of what they might be doing, and then they apply for that. And those that are accepted, and so far we've been able to accept about 95% of them, we pay them a stipend. And so all this support comes from NSF through the STEP grant. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the learning community was really intended to be more or less a pilot project or a prototype. So we only have just the one community, and in the first year we limited it deliberately to 18 students, but we actually ended up with 17 because one of the applicants decided not to come to St. Ed's after all, so we never saw her, and by that time it was too late to add another person, so we stuck with 17 the first year, but then it went up to 24 in succeeding years, and we have now had a cohort every year since 2010. And you can see the distribution of male and female, and you can also see the number of Hispanic students that we managed to recruit, and that was one of the challenges that we had. As a Hispanic serving institution, I thought we would get more applications from Hispanics than we did in the first couple of years, so it was a real challenge just getting students to apply, and it still is somewhat of a challenge. I should also note here that the STEM number reported includes all of the majors in the School of Natural Sciences where I am based, plus majors in environmental science, neuroscience, and psychology, which is in the School of Behavioral and Social Science. Forensic science also used to be in that school, but they have, as of July 1st, moved to the School of Natural Sciences. So you can see what our numbers look like. And then I have one more slide that gives you an idea of the distribution of other ethnic and racial groups here. For the most part, we had Caucasians and we had Hispanics, as you can see from this slide. Then, as I was reporting at one previous conference, somebody was wondering if I was cherry picking among the applications, and so I looked up to see what their ACT and SAT scores were as compared to those of all of the natural sciences majors. I did not have access to the scores for the students in the other three majors that I mentioned, including forensic science as well. So these are not super reliable numbers, but they give you an idea. Intentionally, we were trying to get a good distribution of students. We were trying to get some really strong students, but we were also wanting to recruit students who could use the additional support that we were providing. The strong students were intended to more or less serve as a role model for those students who had a less academic preparation, and that seems to have been fairly successful. But if you look at these numbers, they're pretty close. We really weren't cherry picking, and we didn't have that much option as far as choosing, at least in the first couple years, because we got only a handful more applications than we had slots.
I'm just going to interrupt really briefly here, Richard, with a quick question from Ada Gaye. She would like to know how you improved in the Hispanic recruitment over the years. Basically, what worked and did not work in terms of improving Hispanic recruitment?
That's a very good question, and we are still working on that. But I'll tell you one thing that did work in third, fourth, and fifth years. We hooked up the application to the learning community to the application for on-campus housing. So as soon as they went to on-campus housing, which every student must do because they all have to live on campus, if they were a STEM major, it immediately popped up a screen that told them about the learning community and encouraged them to apply. So if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, I think we had 29 applications in year 2 and we had 60 applications in year 3. And we had 55 in year 4, and I don't remember the other numbers, but that was a significant improvement. Because of some changes that have occurred at the university, including the system they're using for doing housing reservations and the way we do that, that was disengaged, and so my application count went down again to about 30 or 35, so it's a problem I still have yet to solve, unfortunately. All right, so hopefully I've answered that question, and if I come up with anything else, I'll try to keep everybody posted. So a project of this scope, of course, requires assessment, and so we assessed all of the little strategies and interventions we implemented independently of each other. So each of the seminar courses had a survey that was specifically designed around the learning objectives of the courses, and that was administered at the end of every semester, and we used a Qualtrics survey to do that. In the first 2 years, we also had focus groups, so we would get and because the group was so small, we were able actually to talk to all of them to get more feedback on things that were not covered in the surveys. One very useful thing we did was require them to keep online journals. The online journals were done through Blackboard, and unfortunately we have discontinued use of Blackboard in favor of Canvas. But Blackboard does have a journaling option, and it allows you to set it up so that only you, the instructor, and the student can see what's in the journal. So, and I told students that I would be the only one reading them, and if I shared any comments, they would be shared anonymously. So the students could write whatever they want, and most of the time it was very mundane stuff like what happened in class or a movie that they saw, but once in a while they would write about the community, things that I would really want to know but would never know if they didn't tell me, things about problems, things they really liked, and things of that nature. There are also some questionnaires that the university would send around, and I had access to those. Personal interviews, I would sometimes call students into my office when I read something in the journal that concerned me. They would write reports in various ways. And then at the end of their studies at the university, those that made it all the way through, we conducted exit interviews with an external evaluator. So except for the exit interviews, all the data we collected was collected in the first year. In addition, we had institutionally recorded data that was reported, course grades, GPAs, retention statistics, and the like, and all of that is in university records, which I didn't need to get. And then finally, I want to mention a little bit about how we have yet to do our assessment, and we're going to use something called propensity scoring, which I believe was queried about in the last session. Propensity scoring is a particular statistical technique that you can use when a randomized clinical trial is not feasible. The randomized clinical trial, of course, is a gold standard for studies like this, but it really wasn't practical for us to do that. Plus, in 2010, I didn't know anything about propensity scoring. I didn't really know a whole lot about assessing projects of this nature, and I've had to acquire all this stuff as we went. So many of the assessment tools that I talked about evolved over the 5 years. But as it must be obvious to you, this project is definitely influenced by selection bias. And so if you can identify what are called confounding covariates, things that influence students to apply or not to apply and to take advantage of the interventions that are available, if you can identify those and dichotomize them, then you can set up a way to create a pseudo-control group, if you like, and compare the performance of that group against the performance of the experimental group, which would be the LLC students. I can't really tell you much more about that because it requires a whole lot of data collection, which is still in progress, and it's been complicated by the fact that we changed administrative computing systems in 2012. It took 3 years to do that, and not all the data was ported, and not all of it was ported correctly, and so we're still fussing with that. So hopefully I'll get a paper out within the next couple of years. So outcomes then, very quickly. I'm not going to read these, but these are some of the things that I would see in the journals, and they were telling me things that I wanted to hear, like that they really were forming community to the point where some of them even regretted that there was a break because they were going to miss their friends for Christmas and for Thanksgiving, and I found that really remarkable. And another thing that we had hoped would happen, students tend not to know what bioinformatics is. It's an under-enrolled major at the university. And so the workshop that we offer opens their eyes, and we have always recruited a few students out of the learning community who originally came in one major and ended up becoming a bioinformatics major. And I think if we hadn't done that, we might have eliminated that program here. And let's see. Outcomes and retention. You can look at the retention of my STEM group compared to the university-wide STEM retention numbers, and these do include the majors that I mentioned earlier, the psychology, the environmental science. So as you can see, this is year 1 to year 2 retention, and these kids did tend to stick around for the most part. So first year to second year retention was pretty good. Academic performance was also pretty good. They were generally better than the composite STEM others. Again, these numbers, we have to take them with a grain of salt. The propensity scoring will give us more reliable information there. And then finally, outcomes. We have now graduated 3 cohorts, and you can see in the first cohort we had 17 originally, 11 of them finished in STEM. In the second cohort, 15 of them finished in STEM, 19 of them total graduates, the other 4 were not in STEM. And in cohort 3 we have 11 STEM graduates, 15 overall. And so we're doing reasonably well. Part of the reason why I don't have the STEM data for 2011 and 2012 is because of this computer system transfer. We're still trying to get numbers, but anecdotally we feel that we're doing pretty good. And if you look at the percentages here, even if it's only 65%, that's 65% graduation rate, which sometimes was our the best retention rate that we had, and that was just first year to second year. We also have some students in both cohorts 2 and 3 which have yet to complete their studies. And then just to give you a little bit more information from the exit interviews, these are just a few comments that came out of the exit interviews, something for you to think about. These exit interviews again occurred at the end, so just before they graduated. In fact, like 2 weeks before graduation, this is when we did the interviews. And it suggests to us that this is a very viable project for purposes of STEM retention. And since then, it's not in the slides, but we have applied for and received an IU's grant to scale it up to eventually include all STEM majors. We just completed 1 year of that grant, and we are beginning to move in earnest into expanding the community with some modifications. So with that, a couple more exit interview quotes for you to read. I was concerned about cohort scheduling because it's a pain in the butt, let me tell you, but it does seem to be useful. It does help to create those bonds, and those bonds do tend to persist. And the LLC, many of them felt that it was very, very helpful in the transition to college. So with that, I guess I will turn it back over to you, Melvin, to talk about these ongoing questions.
And Melvin, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to jump in with a few questions that we got from the audience. The first question that came in was from Kathy Chen, and she asked, how often did students write in the online journals, and did you have to prompts?
That's a really good question. In the first year, I thought every day, and I was reading all of those every day, but then some of them were not doing them every day, and after a little bit of juggling, I finally settled on once a week, and that seemed to work because they were not doing them every day. And if they had done them every day, it became obvious to me that there's no way I could read them every day, and so I had them do one per calendar week.
Thank you. And then we have another question from Laura Shamir. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. When you require all students to live on campus, you might exclude a population of part-time students that have commitments other than school, for example, childcare. So how do you determine whether the change is the direct impact of the intervention or the indirect impact of the different student selection?
Well, there is a very, very small number of students who do not live on campus the first year. It's like 2%. So we think that the interventions in this particular plan does work. And in fact, we did create a special section of the first year seminar for transfer students, but there were so few of them in there that we merged them with the other students and try to treat them as a whole group. So I hope that answers your question. We do think that these are very effective things, but again, the requirement that all students live on campus is really important, and so I was taking advantage of that.
Richard, I think this is a useful opportunity to talk about the importance of context, because the question is one that really highlights how your institution and is different, and therefore your project would roll out differently at St. Edward's than it would at another institution. So even a project with the same goals, if the institution has a different setup, different set of rules and so forth, the context of the project will be different. And so that's a point we'll come back to throughout the rest of the webinar, but just everyone should keep in mind that no matter what your project is, it is unique because it has been tuned to your local situation. And that will be different for every institution. Other questions, Tanya, that we should address?
I think that we should go ahead and move forward. We have some more questions, but I'm going to hold those until the end.
Okay. Then let's jump into a discussion of data analysis and related things, closing out an evaluation cycle. This is a chart that I've used to describe evaluation steps through each of the 3 seminars. The steps in purple, starting at about 8 o'clock and going to 12 o'clock on the cycle, are the ones that we're specifically sort of addressing today. But again, you see in the center of my little chart is conceptualization, because as you do each of these steps, they don't neatly go around the face of the clock. You end up reconceptualizing or tweaking your conceptualization of the project based upon what you learn as you're doing each of these steps. So just like the implementation of the project will cause you to vary a little bit during the cycle of the program, the conceptualization will also cause you to change your evaluation expectations. This is the chart again that I've used through each of the 3 seminars on the critical logic links. It's intended to say each project starts with a theory of change. You wouldn't be doing a project if you didn't feel there was a way to have some impact. And how you think that change happens, how you think you can have impact, is what drives both your proposal and the design of the project that you ultimately create. There's a lot of confusion. I've heard many people express concern about, well, what's a theory of change and what's a logic model? A useful way of thinking of it is that a theory of change is your global sense of how change occurs. The project logic model is how you've attempted to build a specific set of interventions using that theory of change. And so in reality, when you get funded, your project becomes, your project logic becomes the stand-in for your change theory. And so I'm going to go back and look at one of Richard's questions about selection bias and use this chart to sort of talk about how I would respond to that question. In this case, selection bias is built in not only to his project design, but into his institution and its culture and context. So the expectation that first-year students live on campus is a bias of St. Edward's University that wouldn't be true of UT Austin or some other institution either in the state or across the nation. So bias here is not a negative. It is how the institution has set itself up to function. So one of the things that happens with bias is that it limits or undermines the logic. And you have to look at whether there is an impact on the underlying logic of the project that is unduly influenced by the way you have to select students, and how that selection of students alters the context that students will experience. Because when it does, it creates another explanation for why you might have the results that you have. So the questionnaire, for example, indicated that not having part-time students who had other priorities that they had to meet would possibly alter the outcomes or lead you to believe something different than you should about your outcomes. And that's exactly what I mean by rival explanation. That's another way of explaining the data that challenges whether your project logic holds true in this instance. And so what I argue is that all of those conditions that you cannot change have to become part of your project logic and definition. So when you report your data, you report it for a project where these were conditions of the project. That alerts other potential users to the fact that if my situation, my context is different, then I have to take a step back in terms of thinking about whether these results are going to automatically apply to my situation or not. So it just becomes a part of the project logic model. I think that's a different way of thinking of it than continuing to carry it as if it's a bias that somehow taints your study. It is a fact of life, and other people are going to have a similar set of issues that cannot be altered because of the way their institution is set up. Another question that Richard had on his list was, how do you assess the value of community bonding? And again, I want to point to the critical logic links to illustrate 2 points about how evaluation can be helpful in your conceptualization of these projects. The unit of analysis in Richard's project is the cohort. If you recall, the data was presented for graduation rates and retention rates for each cohort. But in order to create those cohort data, individual data was used, the individual students in the cohort. So the change question is, what is the impact on an individual of community membership? But that's not the only way you can look at the cohort model. You could also look at developing cohort comparisons where you could test whether being in a cohort with bonding opportunities versus a cohort where there were no bonding opportunities was the most, would show a similar kind of difference in terms of impact. So if I can state that more succinctly, the first way of thinking about the question is, what is the impact on the individual of being in the bonding of a cohort? And the second is, can we tease out the extent to which some cohorts provide more bonding than others? An evaluator on your project development team would hopefully raise that question. Which of these are we talking about? And so that points to the potential value of having the person who's going to collect the data and try to make sense of the outcomes part of the conversation about how the project is set up, because all of these things create definitions of the boundaries of the project, and they also create definitions of what is success for the project. Quickly moving on to a third question, is there a way to determine which of several interventions is most effective? And I think that is essentially a universal question. I can't imagine or remember a project where there was one singular intervention. Higher education and STEM matriculation is far too complex to tackle with a single intervention. So we're almost always using multiple interventions in a package as we do our projects. So first of all, identifying what we should expect from the different elements of our intervention should flow from the logic model, and typically that is addressed by a review of the literature. So looking at how other projects that have used the elements of intervention that you've used, figuring out what kind of impact they've had, and using that as a basis for your start off or starting assumptions about what you may have. But one of the things I want to caution everyone about is the assumption of a linear relationship. We often fall into thinking that the relationship is linear among these interventions, and that there isn't an interactive effect between various interventions. And so let me use two of Richard's interventions as an example of what I mean. Block scheduling, meaning having all the students in the cohort take their classes together in the same section, and the living learning community. If you were to do either of those without the second, you would expect a different result than having the two of them together. So assuming that there is an add-on, a simple add-on, by having the two interventions teamed together is probably not an accurate representation of reality, because you build on the living learning situation by having the same faces in your classroom in a different way than if you were, let's say, at a community college, and on Tuesday and Thursday you had the same faces in class, but you didn't see them at any other time. So assuming that there's a linear relationship where you're just adding on an extra ounce of interaction would probably lead you to some erroneous conclusions. So going back to some kind of mapping of the logic that underlies your project is an important conceptual tool to use throughout, and as I said earlier, is something that might be debugged or critiqued by an evaluator early on to make your project more cleanly evaluable. Another question from Richard was, what's the best way to develop reasonable quantitative goals? And this is going to also default back to looking at what the institution requires or expects and linking that and the interventions back to the literature. And again, these are important questions because of how they define what is considered successful in the project. I'll just pick up one other quick example from Richard's project. You may have noted on one of his slides that a student left St. Edward's and went to dental school. And so the question is that a success if the person leaves St. Edward's? This is a problem that many community colleges have as they do STEM work, because many students don't hang around to get the associate's degree, and they've transferred to a four-year school. So it's, I think, inappropriate not to count that student as a success, because in fact they went through the intervention and they moved in the direction that was predicted and desired. So that's another way in which looking at the logic model and the program logic and keeping that in front of you gives you a way of making consistent decisions about things that otherwise would be considered anomalies. And the question would be, what do you do with this situation? Guidance can come from the logic model that's built into the project and the evaluation. This slide is really just a sort of laundry list of some ways in which data collection can occur that isn't intuitively obvious for people who come into evaluation from other fields. in my doctoral program in evaluation, we spent a lot of time in looking at comparative methodology for data collection. I studied political science, anthropology, ethnography, a whole range of fields for how data was collected and how meaning was made of that data. And I use all of that in my evaluation work. So those who've come into it in a different route, where they were specialists, let's say in STEM, and are now evaluating STEM programs, may not have had the benefit of that kind of exposure. So I'm planting the seeds with UPIs to encourage evaluators to think more creatively and more expansively about the kind of data collection strategies that would be useful in your project. Richard talked about online journaling, which is just rich in terms of the possibilities that it provides. Participant observation is another useful one where, let's say, a graduate student is supported in essentially being a participant right along with the others in your project and provides a view of the project from the inside that you could not get reliably from the participants themselves. And that includes interviewing, let's say, the resident advisor on the floor where the living learning community is housed. And the one at the top is one that I keep marketing. I hope somebody will write an article about it one day and it'll become part of the common strategies used. But we have barcode technology now, which would allow us to not only track participation in the different elements of our intervention, but even go to the level of the intensity of engagement. So you have a computer lab that's available to student participants, or you have tutoring. By using a barcode technology where you can simply have a scanner on a smartphone and scan the students in and out of the tutoring session, building a database would allow you to then go back and look at your individual interventions for the level of engagement of students and potentially look at that in terms of which students were more successful and is there a pattern of their participation in our interventions that seems to match up with the level of success that those students have had. It's inexpensive, and I think another thing that technology makes available to us that we might think about how to harness. This slide reminds me to talk about what I think is the most challenging question, either implicit in the questions that I've been asked in STEM evaluation or an overt part of it, and that is the idea about generalizability. In most areas of technology and science, the research strategies are totally organized around the idea that you don't do an experiment and consider it helpful if you can't generalize the results. So randomized control groups and the, as Richard indicated earlier, the gold standard for establishing causality, the experimental control design, all of those things are preferred because we place a lot of emphasis on the idea of generalizability. And I'd like to problematize that a bit by saying that in evaluation, unlike social science research or applied research of any type, you're more concerned about what really happened and learning from what happened than expecting that that knowledge is going to automatically generalize to another situation. If you go back to what I said about St. Edward's uniqueness in expecting first-year students to live on campus, that's a biggie. So if you're not going to be able to generalize from St. Edward's experience in this project to other institutions that don't have that requirement, what's a better place to put your resources? Well, in really understanding what happened at St. Edward's. So I like to de-emphasize the idea of producing generalizable knowledge and say that's better done as a sub-project of social science research, and really emphasize understanding why the results look the way they look.
And if I can interject here a second, Melvin, the farm workshop that we did, that creates community, and anybody technically could really come. You don't have to be living in the learning community. We only limited to the learning community members because that's all we could support with our resources. But if you don't have the requirement that students live on campus, this would be a way to catalyze the creation of community and cohort scheduling, and a first-year seminar course, if you want to do that, would be a way to maintain that community. So they don't necessarily have to be living together, but I certainly took advantage of the fact that they do have to live on campus.
Exactly, yes. So let me just make a couple of more points, and we'll try to keep at least a few minutes available for questions. I think it's important that the PI and all the staff and the evaluator at various points in a project think about what is my relationship to this project and how does my relationship to the project impact my experience of the project. And this is my handy dandy 3-point strategy for doing that. It's like a heuristic to encourage you to think about these 3 things. The first is viewpoint or worldview. It is, how does my attitude about this project and what it's attempting to accomplish, how does my attitude and knowledge of the change theory impact the way I look at this project? You've all probably heard of the deficit model that many people entertain when thinking about underrepresented students. The reason they're not in our classes is because their prior educational experiences haven't prepared them. So that's a deficit that they experience that makes it difficult for them to be successful. If you come to your project with a deficit model, it's going to influence how you analyze and interact with student performance. There are lots of other models that are encouraged other than the deficit model, because the deficit model blames the student for not matching what the institution expects, rather than asking the question, what should my institution do to meet the student where they are, or at least meet them halfway? So thinking about how your attitude relates to the change theory project model, and then how your evaluator's attitude matches up with that. Vantage point. An external evaluator can only see certain things in your project because they're external, and they may visit your institution 3 or 4 times during the life cycle of the project. So that's pretty clear. How do you compensate for that vantage point? I think the best way is to have internal and external data collection going on, coordinated with the external evaluator, and even have staff doing some of their own curating of data that only staff and participants could have access to. So some of the journals or excerpts from journals that Richard talked about. So compensating for vantage point, because there are things that the staff won't be able to see that external evaluators won't be able to see. And voice is synonymous with intent. Whether you're coming into this to pass judgment or to collect information that's going to lead to improvement also alters the way you process and experience the project. Any evaluation that is done, there are 2 things that I can say with certainty. One, you didn't evaluate what you set out to evaluate. And the reason I can say that is because the process of evaluating changes it. All the things that you do for assessment and collecting data alter the project. So what you're getting data on is the evaluated project, not in its pure form. And the second thing I can say with certainty is that evaluation is not definitive. There are other credible, important, logical, useful evaluations that could be done. So no evaluation is totally comprehensive. Therefore, thinking about, of the possible evaluations of my project, how has this evaluation, what has it covered? What is it likely to tell me? How useful is it likely to be? Now, difficult data will come from most rigorous evaluations. And so here are a few suggestions for how to anticipate and handle that. Number one, the contract with your evaluator should cover what are known and predictable issues. I encourage you to go to the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University and look up their checklist. Right off of the main page of their website, they have a checklist, and they'll have a checklist for contracts. Ideas about what you should think about as you write a contract with your evaluator. For example, who owns the data? Who can publish from the data? And that sort of thing. Another thing that can help you with difficult outcome data, interim briefings, so that you don't pile everything up and at the end of a 5-year project, there's a blockbuster report. Interim briefings provide an opportunity to say in a more informal setting, and while there's still a chance to do something about it, things that might need to be changed or looked into. Using multiple reporting formats, again, gives you an opportunity to present difficult data in ways that are more easily received by those who must do something with it. And my final slide is to encourage you to think about the audience versus the stakeholders and sponsors in coming up with your evaluation strategy. I define the audience as the group that has to do something with the outcome of the evaluation. Stakeholders and sponsors are interested, and they should be anticipated as being recipients of the evaluation, but the audience's needs have to have some kind of priority because there is a real expectation that they're going to do something with this. And so by keeping the audience in mind, it's easier to think about producing a persuasive and readable report, something that is within the reach of those individuals based upon the kind of experiences they've had with the project. And finally, often the strongest impact an evaluation can have is the anticipation of evaluation. This is the real strength of the accreditation model. If your institution knows that the regional accrediting group is going to come in 5 years and look at these 12 things, over the 5 years you pay attention to those 12 things. So as a project manager or a PI, one of the ways to build in focus and steadiness into your project is to think about the ways the evaluation can help send a signal to everyone involved what's really important here, because it can influence their behavior throughout the project, and that gives you an extra, let's say, bang for your buck. So I'll end here and provide at least an opportunity for a few questions, and we'll, as I say, respond to those that we can't get to on STEM Central. So thank you, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Melvin. That was very great, wonderful information. And we do have a few questions. We have 1 more minute left for our scheduled webinar, so we'll take maybe 2 questions as quickly as we can, and then give people a chance to leave. But I also feel if people are open to staying later to address additional questions, we can do that, and the recording will be made available on STEM Central afterwards if you missed those questions that we addressed at the end. And so I will go ahead and take this question or comment from Milena Angelova. She says, I think that the ability to generalize the results of a study to a larger student population is of crucial importance because so many grants require institutionalization of certain aspects of the program that are grant supported. In this respect, evaluation should show that these programs, when applied to general student populations, would lead to the same results. I was wondering if you would like to speak to that comment.
Yes. There are a lot of ways to think about generalizability. Generalizability of the specific outcomes versus what you learn in a project that are useful lessons learned that can inform someone developing a project in a similar or even dissimilar space. So I would argue that it's very rare. I've encountered in 40 years no situations where, as a strict experimentalist, I could say the results generalize. Because unfortunately, if you think back to your statistics classes and your research design, we almost always violate some of the central assumptions when we do the statistics for our studies. So I think a literal interpretation of generalizability is problematic. A detailed understanding of what happened and how it might, what factors seem to influence what happened is much more useful, and it's a form of transportability that is much more useful to think about than generalizability.
Thank you. And for one more question before we officially close the webinar, we'll give this one to Richard. Melissa McAlexander asks, did you code your journal entries to give a quantitative look at student responses or use them solely as a qualitative source of information?
So, hi Missy. I use the journals mostly to extract quotes and in my reports, and also to figure out if there was a problem brewing that I needed to deal with. That was how I used it, but I also used the Wordle utility to just look at word frequencies. I have tons of data that I'm sitting on, and it's going to take time to rifle through all that and figure out how to deal with that. But that's all that I've done with the journal so far.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. And it's now 2 past the hour. That's 12:02 for me and 2:02 for those of you on the East Coast. And so I just want to say thank you so much again to Melvin and Richard for taking the time today to share their expertise. Do you guys, either of you, have any concluding remarks before we wrap it up? And then we can also stay a little later if people want to. Is that okay with you guys to stay maybe 5 more minutes? Because there's a few more questions here. I just want to give people a chance to leave if they need to.
Certainly. The one thing I would like to say is to pick up and highlight a word that I just dropped in, and that is transportability. In general, what NSF is looking for, especially in terms of broader impacts, is our opportunity to learn from each other's projects. And I view that as transportability of the ideas and stimulating the ideas of others, which is not as strict in terms of your expectation as generalizability. So I think that that was an important point to come out, and just wanted to add some emphasis to that.
And one thing that I wanted to say is that the STEP grant program, when it was created, was intended to help those of us in the field who are concerned about STEM retention and STEM success to implement best practices on their campus. So there was not a required research component at that time. There certainly was an assessment component. In the new IUSE program, which has replaced it, there is now a research component, an educational research component required as well. And so we've had to look at all the things we did, and we've had to come up with some bona fide research questions that we can investigate in the process of scaling up this learning community, which was limited to one group, mostly because of resources. I noticed there was a question about that. It was always intended to be a pilot. We weren't sure how this was going to work, and the STEP grant program at that time was limited to $500,000 for an institution like mine, which sounds like a lot of money, but it has to last 5 years, and it really, there's no way we could have supported more than one learning community the way we've been doing it. Scaling up requires that we find more cost-effective ways to do the things that we were doing, and we've been working on that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much to both of you, and thank you to the audience. Thanks to all of you for participating. We still have 45 people attending, and so if you have to go, understand, and rest assured that you can get the answers to the questions from the recording or from STEM Central, but I think we can just stay for a few more minutes to address a few more questions that came in. We'll stay for 5 more minutes. One question that I thought would be valuable to address is from Susanna Diedrich. For curriculum-based projects, are there other data collection strategies to use besides pre- and post-tests?
I'll speak to that, and then Richard, I think I saw your movement that you have some suggestions as well.
No, that would be my question too.
Okay, so off the top of my head, here are a few things that I think are important. When you think about curriculum, you are thinking about setting the stage for learning. So a natural is to want to understand if the curriculum had an impact on the performance or the achievement of students that can be translated into a pre and post measure. One of the challenges with pre and post measures is that the difference scores in pre and post measures is less reliable than either of the 2 measures that were used. So just a problem with how the error in those measurements piles up. So I think that some additional things that are important are understanding how the curriculum related to changes in student behavior. So one example is if you have questions, or let's say a test at the end of the curriculum, taking a small group of students and interviewing them about how they responded to the question. Here's the question you answered, and here's your answer. What were you thinking when you read the question, and how did you come up with the answer? By picking those judiciously, you can look back at how your curriculum was effective, whether it imparted the kinds of skills and tools that you expected it to impart. A second kind of intervention that you can use, depending upon your setting, is part of the curriculum is supposed to motivate the learner. And a stand-in for motivation is often time on task, or what a student does with their discretionary time. A way to get at that is to, again, interview students and have them go through what they did that was part of their own choosing relative to the curriculum. What parts of the curriculum they reflected on later, did they find themselves thinking about or using parts of the curriculum in other classes. So looking at the richness of the impact of the curriculum on the student, because that is in part a central goal of all curricular materials. So just a couple of suggestions, but there are many, I think, ways to think about what else is it that the curriculum is supposed to do other than just lead to higher scores, and how do we tap in to understand those things.
Great. Lots of options. I want to pick the next question for Richard from Wanda McCoy. Asks, would it be possible to allow, this is related to your program, Richard, would it be possible to allow the students who could not live on campus to participate in the activities if that fit their schedule?
We had several activities that were associated with the program, mostly social activities, and we did invite, in fact, any STEM major who wanted to come. And we did create a group sort of like a pseudo LLC, if you like, a pseudo learning community, not living learning community that did include transfer students, but their attendance was very spotty, and they didn't create the kind of ties, connections with each other that we had hoped they would. So that's something that requires more thought and more intentional effort than we were able to muster. And as I mentioned previously, we do not have that many transfer students who come in, and so we're talking about a very small pool to begin with, and I did not really have the resources that would be needed to address even a small pool, because anything you do is going to be very time consuming, and you want to include as many students as possible to make it worthwhile to do. So we have not done that, but we did invite them. Some of them did participate. It was very sporadic.
Let me jump in for just a moment with a comment there as well. One of the themes that's run through these seminars is cultural context. And this is an excellent question to raise the point that we should think about how the culture of our students that they bring with them, their expectations, their dispositions, how does that interact with the requirements of the institution and the nature of our interventions? Because what we tend to do is we run an intervention, and at the end we report a summary statistic as if the intervention can be characterized by that. What we lose in that data reduction process is all the nuances of the people who were part of that summary statistic, some of which probably recoiled at the intervention, and others fully embraced it, and others had never experienced it before. So I would argue if there are 30 people in an intervention, based upon what they brought with them to that intervention, there are 30 different sets of experiences. And so in addition to finding ways to match up with the needs of those students that are very different, as the questioner was suggesting, it's also important at the end of the project to understand better what that interaction was like.
Great. Well, I hesitate to keep going. It's 12:12, and we still have 35 people in there. So let's just take one more question. Well, we do have a comment from Ulrike. Sorry about the names, everyone. This person suggests that you can also use attitude surveys for the regarding another method for evaluating success of your education program.
Yes.
So that was a good suggestion. And then
on the attitude surveys, make sure that you have an intervention long enough to influence attitudes. The problem we've often run into is someone is doing an attitude survey at the end of a one semester project, and it's very difficult to fundamentally change important attitudes in that short a period of time. But I wholeheartedly endorse the idea of assessing attitudes in multiple ways, but make sure that it's matched to the strength of the intervention.
And let's take this question from Joshua about CASAR. Can you say a few more words on the actual mechanics of doing barcodes to track and dosage?
Yes.
To track participation and dosage, yeah.
Let's take a hypothetical project where each of the 50 students is given a barcode. You create a notebook with the barcode associated with each student's name, and the notebooks are given to the tutors, to the computer lab operator, to all of the people responsible for the various interventions. And you can, if you want, give the student, let's say, an ID card with the barcode on the back. So the student scans their ID card as they come into the computer lab and as they leave, and as they come into the tutoring session and as they leave. So you have a database which you can then download and analyze, where you're able to look at for each individual student the pattern of their participation.
Okay, I really like that idea for the barcode. It's a great tool. And I think it's 1/4 the hour, so I really feel it's probably time to wrap it up, everyone. It's been extremely interesting webinar, and thank you again to Richard and Melvin for presenting your expertise, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us to the end and sending in your questions. There is a few more questions, but we're going to post those on STEM Central afterwards, so do check out that link that I posted in the chat box. I'll also be emailing it to you, and I'll also be sending you all a post-webinar survey link too, so I hope you can take that too. So thanks so much, and we'll see you on STEM Central.
Great.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Bye.